Most will know Factor 5 for their landmark Rogue Squadron series. While attention rightly goes to that series as a fun, arcadey Star Wars flight game, many might forget about another small title they released between Rogue Squadron and Rogue Leader. Battle for Naboo released a year and a half after Episode 1 came to theaters and took the same gameplay system from Rogue Squadron and attempted to refine it for a prequel title to variable success. Set during the events of Episode 1, the game follows Gavin Sykes, a member of the Naboo security forces who is among those fighting the good fight during the Trade Federation's blockade and invasion whilst our Jedi heroes are enjoying the film. To that end, the events of the game are a rather interesting concept. One of the complaints I've heard over the Phantom Menace is how we never see the effect the invasion of Naboo has over the populace. Battle for Naboo attempts to rectify this with some surprising success, giving us a frontline view of the suffering and desperation the invasion has caused, at least within the context of a pixelated N64 game published by LucasArts. It's not the most story-focused of titles, and I wouldn't exactly call any of the featured characters great or memorable, but there's still a few surprises and the game offers some much-needed context. Factor 5 weren't resting on their laurels either. They wanted to take Rogue Squadron and bring it to the next level, keep advancing the systems, improving them. This is fairly obvious when looking at the dramatically improved view distance, but other things they had less success with. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. Star Wars Episode 1 Battle for Naboo is an arcade vehicle piloting game. Emphasis on vehicle. Unlike Rogue Squadron, you aren't exclusively utilizing flying craft of one sort or another. In fact, most of the vehicles are ground-based, hovering just a couple feet off the ground. It takes a couple missions even before you can pilot your first flyer, and nearly a third of the game goes by before you're thrown into the cockpit of the iconic N1 Naboo starfighter, which dominates the promotional material. No, you begin the game in the seat of a flash speeder, upgrading eventually to the heavy step. This is all to bring the combat closer to the ground, to get you to fight some of the more iconic enemies of the era, such as the battle droids, droideka, and AATs on more even footing. And the result isn't so great. See, while Factor 5 discovered their niche in arcade flying, they never did learn what makes ground combat tick. This was their first real attempt in the series, and while it wouldn't be their last, it certainly foreshadowed what was to come. The problem here is that though these are ground-based vehicles you might presume would control like a car, a tank, or perhaps an on-foot character, they don't. They control like flyers, meaning they always go forward, there's no reverse, and the brakes don't work so good. It was a bizarre way to implement controls and a failed experiment because, frankly, none of the levels featuring these vehicles, from the earlier speeders and STAP to the later heavy Gion speeder or gunboat, are much fun, and the primary reason for that is how unintuitively they control. Part of this in turn has to do with the hover functionality, which never quite works right. Even on flat ground, there's an issue the game has with braking and getting the vehicles to move from a dead stop, as if they're clipping to the floor somehow, which might well be true, as the game world often isn't as solid as it should be. But then they make you take to uneven terrain and the controls become a mess. Your vehicle bouncing all over the place like it's made out of rubber. Worse on the steep hills where the vehicle can't stop on the downhill and will suddenly burst forward on the uphill once terrain evens out. A problem which wouldn't be that big of a deal if the level designers didn't for whatever bizarre reason create a couple necessary tightrope sequences. Or if your hover vehicle didn't explode from a small drop. Yeah. But the flying levels are much improved, taking much of what was great about Rogue Squadron and refining the gameplay, particularly aerial combat. Here they performed a very simple adjustment in an attempt to make enemies dangerous, gave them the ability to shoot in different directions than their nose. It's a bit cheap admittedly, but effective considering the AI limitations, and works far better than what Rogue Squadron provided. Where it doesn't quite work is that the enemies are just a bit too accurate, especially turrets, of whom it's particularly difficult to target one and get your shots off without being hit. To compensate, the game introduces a roll function that moves you while keeping you on target, which works, but I can't say is the most ideal or intuitive way to go about this. Still, the flight levels are good fun while they last, mostly only frustrated when the developers randomly decide to throw you back on the ground for another mission or two before you get into the game proper once more. It's fun seeing where their ambitions took the game. and you can see the influence these ambitions would later have on further refining Rogue Leader down the road. For instance, the game's attempt at boss fights against larger ships, mostly frustrated by design quirks such as a ceiling which is weirdly lower than where your target is, or a target which doesn't look any different than the rest of the ship. Or there's the game's attempt at finally putting battles in space, which turns into a bit of a confusing slog, as without the view distance or any sort of reference point, it's easy to become disoriented and lose which way you're facing, where you're supposed to go, and where enemies are in accordance with you. Yet that's how most of the game winds up, with the developers pushing this just a bit too far past their comfort zone to create something that's ambitious but unrefined, with their lack of knowledge of how certain mechanics would interact and engage with the player. None of this makes for a bad game, mind you. Flying missions are all varying degrees of fun and take up a good half the game or more, though I would have liked to have seen more variety of craft to pilot, then one standing out as the highlight, and the police cruiser playing mostly the same, only worse, and the bomber being a huge, lumbering, and very situational craft you'll only be utilizing for all of one mission. There's a secret craft in the Sith Infiltrator which is good fun, but again, doesn't play all that different from the standard N1. Hell, it's even worse, as the N1 and police cruiser can be upgraded with found bonuses to carry the terrifyingly powerful cluster missiles which will shred most enemies en masse. The ground missions might have been fun, but were ahead of their time for what Factor 5 was attempting to do, even if they knew how to do it. I mean, most people and droids on the ground are little more than a couple sprites glued together, so putting further focus on them probably wasn't the greatest of moves. In the end, this all feels like an experimental step to what the developers eventually wished to create, from space battles to on-foot fighting to even changing vehicles mid-mission. They even came up with the Platinum Awards here, a further end-of-mission award beyond the standard bronze, silver, and gold used to unlock a couple cool secret levels in craft, which itself offers nothing more than bragging rights for an extreme challenge. As an experiment, this is a fun ride, but damn if it also isn't a rough one. If you're a fan of the Rogue Squadron games or wish to see a bit of what was happening on Naboo during the events of Episode 1, Battle for Naboo should provide good fun and nifty entertainment. But if you're looking for a Star Wars-themed, arcade-styled flight game, I would much sooner point you in the direction of any of the Rogue Squadron titles.